In Cedar Grove, where winter nights cut deep and mercy comes in small measures, Thomas Webb has learned to survive on nothing but his dignity and the occasional kindness of strangers. Known as the homeless handyman who fixes cars for hot meals, he's made peace with his solitary existence. But when a brutal snowstorm forces him to seek shelter in an abandoned barn, he finds something unexpected. A woman in designer clothes, trembling in the shadows, clearly running from something. What begins as a simple act of kindness will soon unravel into a story that challenges everything they both believe about worth and belonging. Because sometimes the richest people in the world are the ones with empty bank accounts, and the poorest are those who've never known true connection. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas's fingers trace the worn edges of his leather wallet, lingering over the faded family photo tucked inside. The smiling faces of his younger self, standing proudly in front of Webb's auto repair, felt like scenes from another man's life. 15 years had passed since he'd worn that crisp blue uniform with his name stitched above the pocket, but his hands still remembered every tool, every engine, every problem they'd ever solved. The shop had been his father's legacy, passed down with calloused hands and quiet pride. For 30 years, it had been the heart of Cedar Grove's working community. Farmers brought their tractors, teenagers their first cars, and everyone in between came for Thomas's honest work and fair prices. He'd inherited not just the business, but the trust of 3 generations of families who knew the Webb name meant integrity. Even now, huddled in the barn's shadows, with nothing but his backpack and the mysterious woman's steady breathing in the corner, he could close his eyes and smell the familiar mix of motor oil and coffee that had once defined his mornings. The certification that had taken him 3 tries to earn still lay carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve, tucked between the pages of his father's old service manual. Sometimes, on particularly cold nights, he'd take it out, just to remember who he used to be. The economic crash had come like a slow-moving storm. First, the factory closures, then the farming crisis. One by one, his customers had to choose between fixing their cars and feeding their families. Thomas started doing more work on credit, keeping detailed ledgers of who owed what, never pressing too hard when payment dates came and went. He'd grown up with these people, seen their children born, celebrated their milestones. How could he turn them away? The bank hadn't shared his sentiment. When the foreclosure notice arrived, it bore no trace of the 30 years of history, the countless lives touched, the community built within those walls. Just cold numbers in red ink, growing larger by the day. He'd fought it, of course, sold everything he could, worked 18-hour days, slept on the shop floor to save on utilities. But some battles can't be won with hard work alone. The day they changed the locks, something in Thomas had changed too. Not broken, exactly, but transformed. He'd walked away from the shop with nothing but his tools and the clothes on his back, but he'd kept his father's most important lesson. A man's worth isn't in what he owns, but in what he gives to others. That philosophy had shaped his new life on Cedar Grove streets. He became known as the man who could fix anything with wheels, asking only for a hot meal or a warm place to sleep in return. His customers now were different, struggling single mothers, elderly pensioners, young kids with more dreams than dollars. But the work still gave him purpose. Each repair was a small victory against the chaos that had upended his world. The woman stirred in her corner of the barn, drawing Thomas back to the present. Her expensive clothes were incongruous with their surroundings, like a rose blooming in concrete. Whatever had brought her here, whatever she was running from, he recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same one he'd seen in his mirror the day he'd lost everything. The look of someone whose world had suddenly stopped making sense. The abandoned Miller barn had been a sanctuary for Thomas during the harshest winter nights. Its weathered beams still held strong against the howling wind, and the thick stone foundation kept the worst of the cold at bay. He knew every creaking, board, every draft, every spot where the roof leaked when it rained. But tonight something was different. The air held an unfamiliar tension, like a piano wire pulled too tight. He'd almost missed her in the shadows. If it hadn't been for the quick movement of her hand, an instinctive gesture to tuck away what looked like an expensive silk scarf, he might have settled into his usual corner without ever knowing she was there. But now that he'd seen her, the barn felt smaller somehow, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Thomas said softly, keeping his distance. He'd learned long ago that people were like stray cats, approached too quickly and they'd bolt, just looking for shelter from the storm, same as you, I expect. The woman remained silent, but he could feel her eyes tracking his movements as he set down his backpack. Her breathing was controlled, deliberate, like someone trying very hard not to show fear. The designer clothes she wore were muddy and torn in places, but even in the dim light, Thomas could tell they'd cost more than he used to make in a month at the shop. "Name's Thomas," he offered, slowly unrolling his sleeping bag. "Thomas Webb. Used to run the auto shop in town, if you've been around these parts long enough to remember it." He kept his voice casual, conversational, like they were just two people waiting out bad weather together. A gust of wind rattled the barn doors, making the woman flinch. Thomas noticed she was shivering, though trying to hide it. Without hesitation, he reached into his backpack and pulled out his only blanket, a thick wool army surplus that had seen him through 3 winters. "Here," he said, holding it out like an olive branch. "You look like you could use this more than me right now." For a long moment, she just stared at the offered blanket, conflict clear on her face. Then slowly, she reached out to take it. Her hands were smooth, uncalloused, with perfectly manicured nails now chipped and dirty, as she pulled the blanket. Around her shoulders, something small fell from the folds of her clothing, a crumpled receipt from what looked like a high-end boutique. She snatched it up quickly, but not before Thomas caught a glimpse of numbers that made his head spin. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quiet but cultured, carrying the kind of refinement that came from private schools and summer homes. "I'm Sarah." The slight pause before her name made Thomas wonder if it was really hers, but he didn't press. Everyone had their reasons for keeping secrets. "Well, Sarah," he said, settling back against the wall, "you don't have to tell me. What brought you here? God knows I've got no right to anyone else's story, but if you're running from something dangerous, there's people in town who can help. Sheriff Martinez is good people, and the women's shelter on Oak Street." "No," she cut in sharply, then seemed to catch herself. "No, thank you. I just need somewhere to stay until morning, then I'll be gone." Thomas nodded, recognizing the need for space when he heard it. He'd said the same things himself in those first few weeks after losing the shop, when pride had made accepting help feel like swallowing broken glass. The storm intensified outside, wind howling through the gaps in the wooden walls. Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around herself, and Thomas noticed a flash of gold at her wrist, an expensive watch she quickly covered with her sleeve. Everything about her seemed designed to be hidden, wrapped in layers of secrets, like the blanket now wrapped around her shoulders. "Storm's supposed to last through tomorrow," Thomas said matter-of-factly, pretending not to notice her discomfort. "Might as well try to get some rest. I'm a light sleeper, and nobody comes out here this time of year except me." He couldn't explain why he wanted to reassure her, this stranger who was clearly running from something in her privileged life. Maybe because he remembered what it was like to feel completely alone, even when surrounded by people who claimed they wanted to help. The night wore on, marked by the steady drumming of sleet against the barn's roof. Thomas had been about to drift off when he heard Sarah's stomach growl in the darkness. Without a word, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a paper-wrapped sandwich, a gift from Maria at the corner diner, who never let him leave without something for later. "It's good," he said, carefully tearing the sandwich in half. "Maria makes the best turkey clubs in 3 counties. He held out one half, letting it hover in the space between them like a bridge. Sarah hesitated, but hunger won out over hesitation. "You don't have to share your food," she said, even as she accepted the offering. Her fingers brushed his in the exchange, and he noticed they were ice-cold despite the blanket. "Way I see it," Thomas replied, settling back against his wall, "food tastes better shared. Besides, Maria always makes these too big for one person anyway." It was a small lie, but a kind one. The sandwich would have been his breakfast too, but something about Sarah's obvious discomfort with accepting help made him want to ease her burden. They ate in silence for a while, accompanied only by the storm's symphony. Outside, a newspaper. Page tumbled past the barn's broken window. Tomorrow's edition, Thomas realized, catching a glimpse of a headline about a missing heiress. But his attention was drawn back to Sarah as she carefully folded her empty sandwich wrapper into a precise square. "When I was young," she said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the wind, "our housekeeper used to make sandwiches for me. After school, nothing fancy, just peanut butter and jelly, but she'd always cut them into little triangles and tell me stories while I ate." She traced a triangle in the air with her finger, lost in the memory. She was the only one who ever really saw me, I think, not just what I represented. Thomas recognized the weight in her words, the kind of loneliness that came from being seen as something rather than someone. "People have a way of looking right through you sometimes," he offered. "When I first ended up on the streets, it was like I'd become invisible. Same person I'd always been, just without an address, but suddenly nobody could quite meet my eyes anymore." Sarah turned to face him fully for the first time. "How do you bear it?" she asked, and he heard the genuine need in her question. "The way they look at you or don't look at you." "Found out something interesting," Thomas said, brushing crumbs from his jacket. "The ones who can't see you, they're usually the ones most afraid of being truly seen themselves, but there are always others, like Maria at the diner, or old Mr. Chen, who lets me use his garage sometimes to help folks with their cars. They see the person, not the circumstances." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Sarah pulled the blanket tighter, and Thomas noticed how she held herself, straight-backed even while sitting on a barn floor, like someone who'd had posture lessons drilled into them from childhood. "I used to think I knew what real problems were," she said finally, with a small, self-deprecating laugh. "Bad investments, social embarrassments, family expectations. It all seemed so important then." She paused, struggling with words that seemed to cost her something. I haven't actually been hungry," Thomas finished gently. "Scared? Lost? Join the club? Nobody's born knowing how to handle life when it goes sideways. You learn as you go, same as everyone else." "But you seem so—" She gestured vaguely at his calm demeanor. "Adjusted?" He chuckled. "Took me years to find my feet again. Still learning, truth be told. But somewhere along the way, I figured out that losing everything doesn't mean losing yourself. Sometimes it just means finding out who you really are without all the extra trappings." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, digesting his words. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its practiced polish, becoming more real somehow. "I don't know who I am without the trappings," she admitted. "I'm not sure I ever did." Outside, the storm began to ease, the sleet turning to soft snow. Thomas watched as Sarah absently touched something in her pocket, probably the expensive scarf she'd tried to hide earlier. Her world and his couldn't have been more different, but in that moment, they were just two people sharing a sandwich and pieces of their truth in the dark. Dawn crept into the barn through gaps in the weathered boards, painting stripes of pale gold across the hay-strewn floor. Thomas woke first, his body trained by years of early rising. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world wrapped in pristine, white silence. Sarah was still asleep, curled tightly under his blanket, her face softened by slumber into something younger, more vulnerable. In the clear morning light, the incongruities of her appearance became more apparent. Her clothes, though mud-stained and wrinkled, were clearly expensive, the kind sold in stores where prices weren't displayed. A Cartier watch glinted on her wrist, its face partially obscured by dried mud, but its quality unmistakable. Everything about her spoke of wealth, except for the fear that lingered in her posture even in sleep. A distant sound caught Thomas's attention, voices carried on the crisp morning air. Sarah stirred at the noise, instantly alert, her hand flying to cover the watch. The transformation was immediate. All traces of peaceful sleep vanished behind. A mask of anxiety. "Search parties been through this area twice already," a man's voice drifted through the walls. "No signs of her." "Well, keep looking," came a sharper reply. "She couldn't have gotten far in this weather. The family's offering a reward now, 50,000 for any information." Sarah's breath caught audibly. She pressed herself further into the shadows, though the searchers were still some distance away. Thomas noticed how her fingers nervously traced the edge of her watch, an unconscious tell that spoke volumes about its significance. "They're not close," Thomas said quietly, keeping his voice steady and calm. "And they won't check the barn again if they've already been through. Most people don't look twice at places they think they know." "You sound very certain of that," Sarah whispered, trying to mask her fear with dignity. "Learning where not to be seen becomes second nature after a while," he replied, then added gently, "though I suspect your reasons for wanting to stay hidden are different from mine." The morning light caught the crystal of her watch as she moved, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the barn wall. It was the kind of watch that could have bought back his shop, paid off all his debts, and still left enough for a fresh start. Yet here she was, choosing to sleep on a barn floor rather than wherever she'd come from. "I should go," Sarah said suddenly, standing up and brushing hay from her clothes. "I've already stayed too long." But her eyes darted uncertainly between the barn door and the voices outside, betraying her indecision. "Sometimes," Thomas said carefully, "running away isn't about escaping something bad. Sometimes it's about trying to find something real." He'd seen that look before, in the mirror, in the faces of others who'd lost their way. The difference was, most of them hadn't been wearing timepieces worth a small fortune while they searched. Sarah's hand went to her watch again, but this time she seemed to realize the gesture and forced herself to stop. "You don't understand," she began, then caught herself. "No, that's not true. You probably understand better than most, but I can't." "I can't explain, not yet." Outside, the voices grew fainter, moving away toward the eastern fields. The tension in Sarah's shoulders eased slightly, but the fear remained in her eyes. Thomas began quietly packing his few belongings, giving her space to make her own decision. "If you decide to stay," he said finally, shouldering his backpack, "this barn is safe enough. I know where to find fresh water and I can bring back some food later. No questions asked." He paused at the door, looking back at her. "Or you can walk away right now. Choice is yours. Always has been." The morning sun caught the crystal of her watch one last time, sending light scattering across the barn's interior. Like stars, Sarah stood in that constellation of reflected light, a woman caught between two worlds, the one she was running from, gleaming on her wrist, and the one she'd stumbled into, with its dirt floors and simple truths. Cedar Grove came alive differently in winter. Smoke curled from chimneys, cars hummed in driveways, while their owners waited for warmth, and gossip traveled faster than the cold wind through the small town streets. By mid-morning, word had spread about the strange woman seen near Miller's barn, and with it came the sideways glances and whispered conversations that small towns specialized in. Thomas noticed the change as he made his usual rounds. At the corner diner where Maria typically greeted him with easy warmth, there was an undercurrent of curiosity in her smile. "Heard you had company last night," she said, sliding him an extra coffee along with his regular breakfast. "Must have been quite something to brave that storm." Just someone needing shelter, Thomas replied carefully, accepting the coffee with gratitude. Same as anyone would on a night like that. Maria's eyes softened with understanding. She'd been one of the few who'd stood by him after he lost the shop, who saw past circumstances to the person underneath. "Well," she said, packing up a paper. "A bag with additional food. Better take enough for 2 today. Storm might be gone, but the cold's still biting." Outside the diner, Thomas caught fragments of conversations that made him quicken his pace back to the barn. Words like reward and search party floated on the winter air, accompanied by speculation about the mysterious woman's identity. Cedar Grove hadn't seen this much excitement since the high school football team made state finals 3 years ago. He found Sarah where he'd left her, but she wasn't alone. Old Joe Chen, whose auto shop had become Thomas's occasional workplace, was there with his ancient portable radio. The two of them sat on upturned buckets, tools spread between them as they tinkered with the radio's internal workings. "Thomas!" Joe called out, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Your friend here's got good hands for detail work, better than some mechanics I know." Sarah looked up, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. Her fingers were smudged with grease, incongruous against her expensive clothing, but there was a contentment in her expression that Thomas hadn't seen before. The radio lay partially disassembled before her, its components arranged with precise care. "Found her trying to fix this old thing," Joe explained. "Thought I'd offer some pointers. Sometimes. Keeping your hands busy helps quiet the mind, eh?" The old mechanic's eyes held knowing wisdom, but no judgment. Like Thomas, he'd learned long ago that everyone had their stories, and not all of them needed telling. Thomas set down the food from Maria, watching as Sarah carefully reassembled a small gear mechanism. Her movements were methodical, almost scholarly, like someone who'd learned precision from books before practice. The radio, an old Philips model that had probably seen the Korean War, had been Joe's constant companion for years, its vintage appeal masking its true value as one of the few links to his homeland's broadcasts. "Reception's been terrible lately," Joe continued, his casual tone belying the significance of sharing his precious radio. "Thought maybe fresh eyes might spot what these old ones are missing." Sarah's focus remained on the radio as she spoke. "The capacitor's corroded, and there's oxidation on some of the connections. With proper cleaning and a replacement part." She trailed off, suddenly self-conscious of her expertise. "Impressive," Thomas said quietly, noting how her shoulders relaxed at the simple acknowledgement. "Joe doesn't let just anyone touch that radio. It's special to him. Like family," Joe agreed, patting the radio's casing. "Been with me since I came to America. Sometimes the old things, they carry more than just memories, you know? They carry pieces of who we are." Sarah's hands stilled on the radio's dials. "And if who we are changes?" she asked softly, almost to herself. "What then?" Joe exchanged a glance with Thomas before answering. "Then we tune to a new frequency, but the music, the heart of it, that stays the same." He stood, gathering his tools with deliberate care. "I'll be back tomorrow with that replacement part. Maybe we'll get her singing again, eh?" After Joe left, Sarah stared at her grease-stained hands with a mix of wonder and uncertainty. I've read about circuit repair, but actually doing it." "Theory and practice," Thomas said, unpacking Maria's food. "Sometimes life makes us put the two together in unexpected ways." He handed her a warm sandwich, pretending not to notice how her eyes welled up at the simple gesture. "Joe's good people. Won't ask questions you're not ready to answer. There seem to be quite a few good people in Cedar Grove," she said quietly, accepting the food. The radio sat between them, its silent presence a testament to trust given and received, to the possibility of repair and renewal that went beyond mere machinery. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the barn's weathered walls as Sarah paced the length of the hay-strewn floor. She'd been on edge since spotting a discarded society page photo in town, one that Thomas had glimpsed only briefly before she'd crumpled it in her fist. But that momentary glance had been enough to catch a familiar face at some charity gala, though he couldn't quite place where he'd seen it before. "You know," Thomas said, watching her nervous movement, "sometimes the worst prison is the one we build ourselves." He was repairing a torn sleeve of his jacket, the steady rhythm of needle and thread, a contrast to her restless energy. Sarah paused, running her fingers through her tangled hair, a gesture that spoke of finishing schools and cotillions despite her disheveled state. "What do you mean?" "Secrets," he replied simply. "They get heavier the longer you carry them. Start changing how you move, how you breathe. Watched it happen to my father near the end, when the shop was failing, but he couldn't bear to tell anyone." The comparison seemed to strike something in Sarah. She sank down onto a nearby bale of hay, her designer clothes now properly ruined by days of barn living. "How do you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Live so freely, without pretense?" Thomas tied off his thread, examining his handiwork. "Didn't start out that way. First few months after losing everything, I was desperate to maintain appearances. Kept wearing my old work shirts pressed as best I could. Thought if I looked the part of success, maybe it would come back." He smiled slightly at the memory. "Then one day, I realized the only person I was fooling was myself." A gust of wind rattled the barn door, making Sarah jump. Her hand went instinctively to her pocket, where Thomas knew she kept the crumpled society photo. "It's not that simple," she said softly. "My life. There are expectations, responsibilities, people depending on—" She cut herself off abruptly. "On the image," Thomas finished gently. "The name, the fortune." At her startled look, he continued, "I may be homeless, Sarah, but I'm not blind. The watch alone could buy half the cars I used to fix." She touched the Cartier unconsciously, then forced her hand away. "I thought I could just disappear for a while, figure things out." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Stupid, really. As if someone like me could ever truly vanish." Thomas set aside his mended jacket. "Want to know what I've learned about disappearing?" When she nodded, he continued, "True invisibility isn't about hiding who you are. It's about becoming so authentically yourself that people's expectations slide right past you. They see what they want to see, a homeless man, a drifter, someone to ignore. But inside, you're still you. But what if you don't know who you are?" The question seemed to cost her something to ask. "What if you've spent so long being what everyone else needed that you've lost track of yourself?" Before Thomas could respond, a flash of movement outside caught their attention. A photographer, drawn by the rumors spreading through town, was attempting to get a discreet shot through the barn's gaps. Sarah recoiled from the light like a startled deer, but Thomas was already moving. With the practiced ease of someone used to avoiding unwanted attention, he shifted position to block the photographer's view. "Some lessons," he said calmly, as if nothing had happened. "You learn by doing. Start small. What do you like? Not what you're supposed to like, but what makes you feel real." Sarah's eyes darted to the disassembled radio they'd been working on. "I always wanted to understand how things worked. Used to take apart my alarm clocks as a kid, much to my governess's horror." A genuine smile touched her lips at the memory. "Father said it wasn't appropriate for someone of my position." "And now?" Thomas gestured to her grease-stained hands. "Those same hands just helped Joe with a repair that stumped him for months. Seems to me they know exactly what they're meant to do, even if the rest of you is still figuring it out." The crumpled society page photo lay forgotten in her pocket as Sarah turned back to the radio, her movements becoming more confident as she lost herself in the work. Outside, the photographer eventually gave up and left, having failed to capture anything more interesting than a typical barn scene. But inside, something subtle had shifted, like a gear finally clicking into place, starting a mechanism that had long been still. Dawn found them walking through Cedar Grove's quiet streets, their breath forming clouds in the winter air. Sarah wore Thomas's spare jacket over her designer clothes, a handmade bracelet of copper wire and salvaged beads, crafted by one of his homeless friends, jangling at her wrist. The transformation in her bearing was subtle but significant. She moved with less rigid precision, her shoulders relaxed despite the early hour. "First stop's always Maria's," Thomas explained as they approached the corner diner. "She saves the day-old bread and coffee for folks who need it." He paused, watching Sarah's expression carefully. "You don't have to come in if you're not comfortable." But Sarah squared her shoulders, something of her old confidence mixing with her new humility. "I want to understand," she said simply. "Show me your world, Thomas." The bell above the diner's door chimed their entrance. Maria looked up from behind the counter, her wise eyes taking in Sarah's presence without comment. "Usual crowds running. Late today," she said to Thomas, sliding 2 cups of coffee across the counter. "Weather's keeping them close to the shelter." "We'll take it to them," Thomas replied, accepting a box of pastries and bread with practiced ease. He noticed how Sarah observed the interaction, the lack of pity, the simple dignity of the exchange. Their next stop was the homeless shelter, a converted church basement where a dozen or so people had taken refuge from the cold. Thomas knew each of their stories. Jake, the veteran still fighting battles in his mind. Rosa, whose medical bills had cost her everything. Mike, the former teacher whose addiction had stripped away his former life. "Morning trouble," Jake called out, his weathered face breaking into a smile at Thomas's approach. His eyes flickered to Sarah with military sharpness, assessing, but he kept his questions to himself. Sarah helped distribute the food, her initial awkwardness giving way to genuine engagement. Thomas watched as she sat with Rosa, listening intently to the older woman's story about her granddaughter's recent art show, displayed proudly on a wrinkled phone with a cracked screen. "She's got real talent," Rosa was saying, showing Sarah a child's vibrant painting. "Saves up her allowance to buy me phone credit so I can see her pictures." Pride and pain mingled in her voice. "It's beautiful," Sarah replied softly, her fingers tracing the phone's cracked edge. "She uses color like she's painting with joy itself." The genuine appreciation in her voice made Rosa beam. Mike approached them next, clutching his prized possession, a dog-eared copy of The Great Gatsby he used to teach to his high school students. "Always said it was a warning, not a celebration," he said, his educated accent cutting through. His rough appearance, about the emptiness of wealth without purpose. Sarah accepted the book with careful hands, her expression thoughtful. "I used to read it very differently," she admitted. "It seemed glamorous once." "Funny how perspective changes things," Mike replied, with the insight of someone who'd seen both sides of life's dividing line. As the morning wore on, Thomas led Sarah through the rest of his daily routine. They helped Mr. Chen organize his garage for the day's work, the old radio now displaying promising signs of life on his workbench. They assisted Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow, with her groceries, Sarah learning the careful calculus of helping without wounding pride. Near noon, they found themselves in the small community garden some of Thomas's friends had started behind the shelter. Despite the winter, a few hardy plants persisted under makeshift greenhouse coverings. "This is where it started," Thomas said, showing Sarah the tiny plots. "People said nothing would grow here, that it was a waste of time, but you'd be amazed what can flourish in unlikely places." Sarah knelt to examine a struggling tomato plant, her designer pants now thoroughly stained with dirt. The copper wire bracelet caught the winter sunlight as she gently adjusted the plant's support stake. "They're all so connected," she said wonderingly. "Everyone knows each other's stories, helps where they can." "That's real wealth," Thomas replied, watching her work. "The kind that doesn't show up in bank accounts or society pages." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When you have nothing left to hide behind, you learn to see people for who they really are, and let them see you too." Sarah sat back on her heels, absently touching the handmade bracelet that had replaced her Cartier watch for the morning. In her face, Thomas could see the struggle between two worlds, the one she'd left, with its gilded constraints, and this one, with its raw but genuine connections. The shelter's ancient heating system gave out on one of the coldest afternoons of the year. Sarah stood in the basement, watching her breath cloud in the air as the shelter director, Pastor Mike, explained the situation to the worried residents. The repair estimate he held in his trembling hands might as well have been a death sentence for the shelter's already strained budget. "We'll figure something out," Thomas was saying, his calm voice cutting through the rising panic. "Mr. Chen might have some spare parts we can use, and I can take a look at the system. Picked up a thing or two about heating during my shop days." Sarah lingered in the background, her mind racing. She knew she could solve this problem with a single phone call, a single signature. The amount needed was less than she'd once spent on a handbag, but revealing her identity, even anonymously, felt dangerous. Too many questions, too many connections that could be traced. Later that evening, while Thomas was helping Mr. Chen with another car repair, Sarah slipped away to the local bank. Her hands shook as she filled out the deposit slip, carefully disguising her handwriting. The check she wrote was signed with a nearly illegible scrawl, the amount enough to cover both the heating system and a year's worth of maintenance. "Would you like a receipt?" the teller asked, eyes widening at the amount. "No," Sarah said quietly. "Just make sure it gets to the shelter." Anonymous donation. She turned quickly, almost colliding with an elderly woman entering the bank. "Oh, careful, dear," the woman said, steadying her. "My eyes aren't what they used to be." She squinted at Sarah. "You're Thomas Webb's friend, aren't you? The one helping at the shelter?" Sarah froze, but the woman's smile was kind. "I'm Margaret Whitman. I remember when Thomas had his shop, used to fix my car for practically nothing when times were tight. Good man, never lost his kindness, even after everything." Something in Margaret's voice made Sarah pause. "You knew him before?" "Oh yes. This town wasn't always kind to Thomas after he lost the shop. People he'd helped for years suddenly couldn't meet his eyes, but he just kept right on helping anyway." Margaret's gaze was shrewd. "Reminds me of someone else I've been watching lately." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but Margaret merely patted her arm. "Don't worry, dear. We all have our secrets. What matters is what we do with them." Back at the shelter that evening, Sarah found Thomas hunched over the broken heating unit, tools spread around him like surgical instruments. In the weak light, she could see the worry lines around his eyes, though his voice remained steady as he explained basic maintenance to a group of interested residents. "Sometimes," he was saying, "it's not about fixing everything at once. It's about keeping things running until a better solution comes along." His hands moved surely through the machinery, making small adjustments. Each little improvement matters. Sarah touched the spot in her pocket where the bank receipt would have been had she accepted it. The weight of her secret felt different now, not lighter exactly, but more purposeful. She thought of all the times she'd written checks for charity galas, posing for photos, with oversized cardboard displays. This nameless donation felt more real somehow, more meaningful. "Need an extra pair of hands?" she asked, kneeling beside Thomas. He looked up, surprise and something warmer flickering across his face. "Always," he replied, making space for her. In his workspace. "Grab that wrench, I'll show you how to check the connections." As they worked together in the basement's dim light, Sarah realized she felt more herself in these grease-stained moments than she ever had at board meetings or charity functions. The heating system's problems were straightforward, solvable. No hidden agendas, no political maneuvering, just the honest work of making things better. A few days later, when Pastor Mike announced the miraculous anonymous donation at the shelter's community dinner, Sarah kept her eyes on her plate, but she felt Thomas's gaze on her, thoughtful and quiet, and wondered if he somehow knew. He'd seen enough of life to recognize the different ways people found to heal themselves by helping others. The room buzzed with joy and relief, plans already being made for improvements beyond just the heating system. Sarah watched as Rosa hugged her granddaughter, who could now visit without wearing 3 coats. She saw Jake relaxing slightly, some of his ever-present tension easing with the warmth. In their faces, she saw something her family's charitable foundation had never shown her: the immediate human impact of kindness given freely, without recognition or reward. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a black SUV with tinted windows, crawling slowly past the shelter. Sarah saw it from the window while helping sort donated clothes, and her whole body went rigid. Her fingers found the family ring. She always wore, platinum and sapphire, generations old, twisting it anxiously around her finger. "You know them?" Thomas asked quietly, noting her reaction. He'd gotten better at reading her tells over the past week. The way she touched the ring when nervous, how she scanned every room for exits, the slight flinch whenever a car slowed near her. "They work for my Faye," she caught herself. "They're not friends." Thomas moved casually to block her from the window's view, his presence solid and reassuring. "Back door's always open," he said simply. "Path through Chen's lot leads to 3 different streets, just in case you need to know." Their hands brushed as they folded a blanket together, and Sarah felt the now familiar flutter in her chest. At the contact, these moments had been happening more frequently, little touches that lingered, glances that held too long, words that carried double meanings neither of them was ready to acknowledge. "I never asked," she said, desperate to think about something other than the SUV. "Why did you stay in Cedar Grove? After the shop, you could have started fresh somewhere else." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling on the blanket. "Tried, actually. First month after losing everything, I walked all the way to Portsmouth. Thought maybe a bigger city would have more opportunities." He smiled slightly. "Found out pretty quick that opportunities weren't what I was looking for." "What were you looking for?" "Purpose, maybe. Meaning. In Portsmouth, I was just another homeless man, invisible. Here," he gestured around the shelter, "here I can still help people, still be useful. These folks know me, know my story. No need to hide or pretend." Sarah's ring felt heavy on her finger. "Must be nice," she said softly, "not having to pretend." Thomas turned to her then, his expression serious. "Sarah," but whatever he was about to say was cut off by the sound of another vehicle outside. This time it was a police car, moving slowly past the shelter. Sarah's heart began to race, and without thinking, she stepped closer to Thomas, seeking the comfort of his proximity. "Hey," he said gently, close enough now that she could feel the warmth of him. "Whatever you're running from, you don't have to face it alone." She looked up at him, suddenly aware of how little space remained between them. His eyes were kind, questioning, holding none of the judgment she'd grown up expecting from others. It would be so easy to close. That distance, to find out if his lips were as gentle as his words. The police radio crackled outside, loud in the winter quiet, and reality crashed back in. Sarah stepped away, her hand going to her ring again. "You don't understand," she said, hating how her voice shook. "I'm not who you think I am." "I think you're exactly who you are," Thomas replied. Maybe for the first time. He moved toward the window, checking the street. "Cars are gone, but they'll be back. They always come back for what they think they own." The bitterness in his voice surprised her. "Speaking from experience? The bank, when they took the shop." His jaw tightened at the memory. "Kept coming. Around, making offers that looked good on paper, but would have meant compromising everything my father built. Wanted to turn it into some chain franchise operation." He shook his head. "Sometimes losing everything is better than losing yourself piece by piece." Sarah thought of her life before. The endless charity galas, the board meetings, the carefully orchestrated public appearances. Each one a small compromise, a tiny piece of herself traded for approval. Her ring caught the light. The sapphire, her family's signature stone, a constant reminder of expectations and obligations. "But what if yourself isn't enough?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. "What if you're letting down everyone who depends on you?" Thomas turned back to her, and for a moment She thought he might close that distance between them again. Instead, he picked up a sweater from the donation pile, hand-knitted, slightly worn but made with obvious care. "Someone made this," he said, running his thumb over the stitches, put time and love into it, then gave it away, hoping it would help someone else stay warm. They didn't need their name on it, didn't need recognition. He held it out to her. "Sometimes the most valuable things we do are the ones nobody knows about." Sarah accepted the sweater, her fingers brushing his again. This time neither of them pulled away immediately. In the growing dusk outside, shadows lengthened across Cedar Grove streets, and somewhere a black SUV continued its patient search. The truth arrived with the morning paper, its headline impossible to ignore. "Missing Heiress Sarah Blackwood spotted in Cedar Grove." The tabloid's grainy photo showed Sarah and Thomas outside the shelter, her face partially turned away but still recognizable. The article detailed her status as sole heir to the Blackwood Investment Group's billions, her sudden disappearance from a charity gala 2 weeks ago, and the mounting pressure on her family's company in her absence. Thomas found the paper on Maria's counter when he stopped for their usual morning coffee. His hands trembled slightly as he read, pieces clicking into place, the watch, the mannerisms, the mysterious donation to the shelter. Sarah Blackwood. The name carried weight even in Cedar Grove, where her family's investment firm had bought and restructured several local businesses over the years, including his father's shop. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The chain franchise operation that had tried to buy them out, that had been her family's company. The pressure that had ultimately forced them into bankruptcy had come from the very empire Sarah stood to inherit. He found her in Mr. Chen's garage, bent over, the now working radio, making fine adjustments to improve its sound. She looked up at his approach, her smile fading as she saw the newspaper in his hands. "Thomas," she began, but he cut her off by placing the paper on the workbench between them. "Sarah Blackwood," he said, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. "Of Blackwood Investment Group." She straightened slowly, her hand going to her ring, the sapphire suddenly recognizable as the Blackwood family crest. "Yes," she said quietly, "that's who I was. Am. Was it all a game to you?" The words came out sharper than he'd intended. "Slumming it with the people your family helped put on the streets? Getting a taste of how the other half lives?" "No!" The hurt in her voice seemed genuine, but Thomas had learned long ago that the wealthy played by different rules. "It wasn't like that. I needed to understand." "Understand what?" "How it feels when everything you've worked for gets stripped away by people who see your life as nothing but numbers on a spreadsheet." He picked up the paper again, scanning the article. "Says here, you disappeared from the Aurora Foundation's annual gala. Must have been quite the crisis, right in the middle of caviar and champagne." Sarah flinched at his tone. "You don't know everything about that night, about why I left." "I know your family's company forced dozens of small businesses into bankruptcy. I know they bought up properties at rock-bottom prices and flipped them for profit. I know my father died thinking he was a failure because he couldn't save his life's work from people like you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of unspoken pain. Sarah stood very still, her face pale but composed. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The night I left, I had just discovered what my father's board was planning. A revitalization initiative for small towns like Cedar Grove. Buy out local businesses, replace them with franchises, all in the name of progress." She touched the radio, her fingers gentle on its worn dials. "I was supposed to announce it. At the gala, my first major move as the company's new public face." Thomas wanted to hold on to his anger, but something in her expression made him pause. "What happened?" "I ran," she laughed, a small, broken sound. "All my life, I'd done what was expected. Smiled for the cameras, signed the papers, played my part. But standing there, looking at the plans, seeing the lives that would be destroyed." She met his eyes. "I couldn't be part of it anymore." So you just left with nothing but the clothes I was wearing and my family ring? Started walking and didn't stop until I found that barn. She touched her ring, then deliberately removed it, placing it beside the newspaper. I'm not asking you to forgive my family's actions, or me, for not telling you the truth sooner. But these past weeks, working in the shelter, helping people, learning from you, her voice caught. That's the most real thing I've ever known. Thomas stared at the ring, its sapphire catching the morning light. The same light that had danced in Sarah's eyes when she'd finally got the radio working, that had softened her face when she played with Rosa's granddaughter, that had warmed her smile during their almost kiss. Everything he'd thought he knew about her shifted, realigning itself around this new truth, this revelation that felt both shocking and, somehow, inevitable. The news spread through Cedar Grove like wildfire. By noon, reporters had descended on the small town, their satellite vans clogging the narrow streets. The shelter, usually a haven of quiet dignity, buzzed with tension as camera crews attempted to get shots through the windows. Inside, Sarah sat at a corner table, clutching the thermos Thomas had given her days ago. A simple gift that now felt like it belonged to another lifetime. "Miss Blackwood?" Pastor Mike approached carefully, his kind face troubled. "There are some men outside. They say they're your family's security team." "I know." Sarah's fingers tightened around the thermos. "They've been waiting for someone to confirm they found me." She looked up at the pastor, her eyes pleading. "I'm sorry for bringing this chaos to your door. Child," he said gently, "this shelter exists precisely for people who need a place to find themselves, though I admit we don't usually get billionaire heiresses." Outside, a sleek black car pulled up, and a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit emerged. Sarah's breath caught. Richard Maxwell, her father's right-hand man and her childhood mentor. He'd taught her to play chess, helped her with her economics homework, groomed her to take her place in the family empire. His presence meant this wasn't just a security retrieval, this was an intervention. Thomas watched from across the room, his expression unreadable. The thermos he'd given her had been a small gesture, something to keep her coffee warm during cold mornings at the shelter. He'd found it at a thrift store, cleaned it up, even fixed the vacuum seal. Now it seemed like a mockery of their connection, a cheap token offered to someone who could buy 1,000 like it without blinking. "Sarah!" Richard's voice filled the shelter as he entered, managing to project both authority and paternal concern. "Everyone's been worried sick. Your father is too busy with the board to come himself?" Sarah's voice was sharp, years of boardroom training evident in her tone. "Or did he send you to handle the PR nightmare?" Richard's face softened with what looked like genuine hurt. "You know he's not well. The stress of your disappearance." He glanced around the shelter, taking in the worn furniture, the donated clothes, the faces of the residents. "What are you trying to prove here?" "I'm not trying to prove anything." Sarah stood, still holding the thermos like a shield. "I'm trying to understand what real value is, what it means to help people directly, not just through tax-deductible donations and press releases. And has playing at poverty given you the insights you sought?" Richard's voice was gentle but cutting. "Have you found what you're looking for in this experiment?" Thomas couldn't listen anymore. He headed for the back door, needing air, space, perspective. But Sarah's voice stopped him. "It's not an experiment." She set the thermos down with deliberate care. "These people, this place, they've taught me more about genuine human connection in 2 weeks than I learned in 20 years of charity galas." "And what about your responsibilities?" Richard pressed. "The Foundation's initiatives are stalled. The board is questioning your commitment. Thousands of employees depend on stable leadership." "Stable leadership?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Like the Revitalization Initiative? Destroying communities in the name of progress?" A flash of something, resignation perhaps, crossed Richard's face. So that's what triggered this rebellion. "Sarah, the business world isn't simple. Sometimes difficult decisions—" "Look around you!" Sarah gestured at the shelter. residents who were watching the exchange with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. These aren't difficult decisions on a spreadsheet. These are people's lives, their homes, their businesses, their communities. Speaking of businesses, Thomas said quietly, finally turning back to face them, how many family shops did Blackwood Investments acquire last year? How many underperforming assets got liquidated? Richard assessed Thomas with shrewd eyes. You must be the homeless mechanic she's been staying with, Thomas Webb, isn't it? Former owner of Webb's Auto Repair. His smile was professionally sympathetic. Unfortunate situation, that. The market can be unforgiving. The market? Thomas's voice was controlled, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. Is that what you call deliberately squeezing small businesses until they have no choice but to sell? Creating desperate situations you can profit from? Thomas, please! Sarah stepped toward him, but he moved away. No, you should hear this. Your family's company didn't just buy my shop. They bought out our suppliers first, raised our costs, until we couldn't compete. Created the very crisis they then offered to save us from. He looked at Sarah, and the pain in his eyes made her chest ache. Did you know that? Did you read those details in your board reports? The story exploded across social media platforms within hours. Blackwood Heiress trended nationwide, with viral posts dissecting every aspect of Sarah's disappearance and discovery. Some painted her as a rebellious socialite playing poverty tourist, others as a brave whistleblower exposing corporate greed. Video clips of her outside the shelter played on loop on news channels, while financial analysts debated the impact on Blackwood Investment Group's stock price. Thomas couldn't escape the noise of it all, even in Mr. Chen's garage. The old radio they'd fixed together now carried hourly updates about Sarah's heartwarming romance with a homeless mechanic. Each broadcast twisted their story into something unrecognizable, either a modern fairy tale or a scandal, depending on the station's angle. They're saying I seduced you for money, he said quietly, showing Sarah the latest viral post on a borrowed phone. That I knew who you were all along. Sarah sat on their usual workbench, looking small and tired in yesterday's clothes. The social media storm had been particularly cruel to her, dredging up old photos from charity events and placing them side by side with grainy shots of her at the shelter. Blackwood Heiress trades tiara for trailer park, read one particularly vicious headline. I never cared about the money, Thomas continued, his voice rough. You know that, right? I know. She touched his arm gently. Just like I never cared about your circumstances. But they'll never understand that. They'll make us into whatever story sells better. Outside, a group of reporters had stationed themselves across from the garage, hoping to catch the homeless Romeo and Juliet in an intimate moment. Their cameras flashed whenever anyone moved near the windows. My father's company, Sarah said suddenly. They didn't just target your shop, did they? The whole revitalization plan, it was systematic, town after town. Thomas nodded slowly. First, they'd buy up key properties, raise rents, then pressure local suppliers, manipulate prices, create impossible situations, then sweep in with generous buyout offers. His hands clenched. By the time most people realized what was happening, it was too late. I'm going to stop it. Sarah's voice held steel beneath the exhaustion. Use my position, my shares, my vote on the board. Make it right. Can you? Thomas asked, not unkindly. Won't they just remove you? Find someone more cooperative? Before Sarah could answer, Mr. Chen entered the garage, carrying a tablet. You should see this, he said, his usual calm demeanor disturbed. The screen showed a business news channel where Richard Maxwell was giving a press conference outside Blackwood headquarters. While we're relieved to have located Sarah, Richard was saying smoothly, we're concerned about her state of mind. The stress of preparing to take on more responsibility in the company, combined with her naturally sensitive nature, may have triggered this episode. The board has unanimously agreed that a period of rest and evaluation would be beneficial. before any major decisions about her role in the company are made. They're going to try to declare me unstable, Sarah whispered, understanding dawning in her eyes. Discredit anything I might say about their practices. Paint this whole thing as a mental health crisis. Thomas felt a familiar, helpless anger rising, the same feeling he'd had watching his father's business slip away. They can't just... They can, Sarah cut in. They will, unless... She trailed off, her mind clearly racing. Unless what? Unless we change the story. She stood up, energy replacing her earlier fatigue. They want to control the narrative? Fine. Let's give them a narrative they can't. Control. She turned to Mr. Chen. Is that camera still recording out there? The old mechanic nodded, a slight smile touching his lips. All of them are. Always. Sarah squared her shoulders, a lifetime of media training visible in her posture. Then let's give them something worth recording. Something real. She looked at Thomas, her eyes both questioning and determined. If you're willing to trust me, one more time. Thomas studied her face, the face that had launched 1,000 headlines, that had graced society pages and charity ball photos. But all he saw was the woman who had helped fix an old radio, who had served meals at the shelter, who had looked at him like he mattered not for what he had, but for who he was. Sarah stepped out of Mr. Chen's garage into the wall of cameras and microphones, her heart pounding but her steps steady. Thomas followed a few paces behind, still uncertain of her plan, but trusting her intention. In her hand, she clutched a small brass key, the key to her private cottage in the mountains, a sanctuary she'd bought in secret years ago. It was the one piece of her old life that had been truly hers, not controlled by the family empire. Miss Blackwood, is it true you're having a mental breakdown? Sarah, were you kidnapped? Is this a publicity stunt for the company? What about the homeless man? Did he take advantage of you? The questions came rapid fire, overlapping in their urgency. Sarah held up her hand, and years of board meeting experience commanded silence. My name is Sarah Blackwood, she began, her voice clear and strong. And yes, I am the heir to Blackwood Investment Group. But that's not why I'm speaking to you today. She glanced back at Thomas, drawing strength from his presence. I'm here because it's time for some truth. The cameras pressed closer, sensing a story bigger than they'd anticipated. Richard Maxwell's car screeched to a halt at the edge of the crowd, but Sarah continued before he could intervene. 2 weeks ago, I discovered documents detailing my family's company's systematic destruction of small businesses across America. Towns like Cedar Grove, where generations of hard work are erased by corporate greed disguised as progress. She took a deep breath. I didn't run away because I was having a breakdown. I ran because I couldn't bear to be part of that destruction anymore. Sarah! Richard's voice cut through the crowd. Think about what you're doing. I have thought about it. For the first time in my life, I'm thinking clearly. She turned to face Thomas, who stood quietly in the garage doorway. I found shelter in the barn on the coldest night of the year, and there I met a man who had every reason to hate someone like me. Instead, he showed me what real wealth looks like. The cameras swung between them, capturing every nuance of the moment. Thomas felt the weight of their attention, but found he could only focus on Sarah's face, on the truth he saw there. You want to know if this is a story about a rich girl slumming it? About a homeless man taking advantage? Well, here's your story. Sarah's voice caught slightly. I fell in love with Thomas Webb, not because of some fairy tale fantasy or mental breakdown, but because he taught me that true value isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the ways we help each other, in the connections we build, in the communities we strengthen. She held up the key, letting it catch the morning light. This key opens the door to a place that's mine, not my family's, not the company's. I bought it years ago, dreaming of escape. But standing here now, I don't want to escape anymore. I want to fight. For this town, for others like it, for the people who gave me shelter when I had nothing but my conscience left. Thomas stepped forward then, unable to stay silent. Sarah, you don't have to... Yes, I do. She turned to him fully now, ignoring the cameras. You asked me once what I was running from. The truth is, I was running toward something, toward this, toward you, toward the person I could be when all the pretense was stripped away. The key trembled slightly in her outstretched hand. I'm not asking you to forgive my family's actions. I'm asking you to help me make them right, not as a homeless man or a former business owner, but as the person who showed me what integrity really means. The person I love. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the moment, but Thomas barely heard them. He looked at the key, this offering that represented not just a door to a house, but a choice, a bridge between their worlds. You could lose everything, he said quietly, but not so quietly that the cameras couldn't catch it. Your inheritance, your position. Sarah's smile was both tender and fierce. I already found everything I need. The question is, are you brave enough to accept it, to fight this battle with me? The following days unfolded in a whirlwind of headlines and hastily called board meetings. Sarah sat in her father's modernist office tower, her worn shelter clothes replaced by a simple business suit, facing down the board members who had once seemed so intimidating. On the table between them lay a joint bank account application, not yet signed, but symbolic of the bridge she and Thomas were trying to build between their worlds. This is corporate suicide, Gerald Morton, the senior board member, insisted. Going public with accusations against our own acquisition practices, the shareholders will revolt. They're not accusations, Sarah replied calmly. They're facts, facts that I'm prepared to present to every media outlet and regulatory body in the country. She met each board member's eyes in turn. Unless we change course, dramatically and immediately. Change to what? Someone scoffed. Giving away properties at a loss, running this company like a charity. Running it with conscience, Sarah corrected. Starting with Cedar Grove. We're going to restore local ownership, provide recovery grants to businesses we displaced, and implement a new community development model that builds up existing businesses instead of replacing them. The board erupted in protests, but Sarah held up her hand. I own 30% of this company's shares. Combined with my father's voting rights during his illness, that's a controlling interest. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, but it will be done. Meanwhile, across town, Thomas sat with Mr. Chen and Pastor Mike, sketching out plans for a community business recovery program. His expertise as a former business owner, combined with his understanding of the community's needs, made him uniquely qualified to help structure the initiative. It's not charity, he explained to a group of skeptical former business owners. It's restoration, making right what was done wrong. He thought of Sarah facing down her board with the same conviction. Sometimes, the hardest part of rebuilding isn't the physical work, it's believing you deserve the chance. The media portrayed their story as a modern-day Robin Hood tale, the billionaire heiress and the homeless mechanic taking on corporate greed. But the reality was more complex, more nuanced, filled with small moments of adjustment and understanding. Like when Thomas first visited Sarah's cottage in the mountains, expecting opulence but finding a simple, almost austere space. I bought it furnished from a local artist, she explained, showing him the handmade furniture and practical kitchen. It was the first thing I ever owned that wasn't about impressing someone else. Or when Sarah joined Thomas for his morning rounds, no longer playing at understanding poverty, but working to create real change. She sat with Rosa, helping her navigate the grant application for a small alterations business. She learned basic car maintenance from Mr. Chen, her designer clothes now permanently stained with motor oil. The balance wasn't always easy. Thomas struggled with the transition from survival mode to having resources at his disposal. I don't need access to your money, he said one evening, staring at the unsigned joint account application. It's not about need, Sarah replied. It's about trust, partnership. She touched his hand gently. I trust you with my heart. Why not? With this, Because money changes things, changes people. I've seen it happen. It already changed me, she said quietly. Meeting you changed me back. She pulled out her family ring, now worn on a chain around her neck rather than her finger. We're not our circumstances, remember? You taught me that. The board's resistance gradually began to crack under the weight of public opinion and Sarah's determined leadership. The Cedar Grove initiative, as it came to be known, would become a model for responsible corporate investment in small communities. Thomas's practical experience proved invaluable in shaping policies that actually worked. On the ground level, you know, Sarah said one evening, as they sat in Mr. Chen's garage working on another car together, my father used to say that business was about seeing opportunities others missed. I don't think this is what he meant, but he wasn't entirely wrong. Thomas looked up from the engine. What opportunity do you see? The chance to prove that profit and conscience aren't mutually exclusive. That real value isn't just about quarterly returns. She smiled, grease smudged on her cheek. That sometimes the best investment you can make is in people who've never had a fair chance. The blueprint for the Cedar Grove Community Business Center lay spread across the shelter's main table, its crisp lines and professional notations a stark contrast to the worn surface beneath. But it was the handwritten notes in the margins that truly told the story. Thomas's practical adjustments, Sarah's funding solutions, and input from dozens of community members who'd joined their cause. We'll need a proper garage set up here, Thomas explained to a group of interested residents, his finger tracing the proposed layout, not just for repairs but for training. Teaching basic maintenance can help people save money, maybe even start their own businesses. Jake, the veteran who'd been one of the shelter's longest residents, leaned forward with interest. Could help with employment too. A lot of folks here have skills, just need a chance to prove it. The center would be more than just a building. It would be a testament to what was possible when community knowledge met corporate resources. The blueprint included workshop spaces, classrooms, a small business incubator, and most importantly, a free consulting service for local entrepreneurs facing predatory buyout attempts. Remember when you first taught me to check engine oil? Sarah asked later as they reviewed the plans in private. You said sometimes the simplest knowledge makes the biggest difference. Thomas nodded, thinking of all the small lessons that had passed between them. Never thought I'd be designing training programs for a corporate-backed community center. Having second thoughts? No. He touched the blueprint gently, just remembering something my father used to say, that every tool in his shop had two purposes, fixing what was broken and teaching others how to prevent breaks in the first place. The center's development became a community effort. Mr. Chen offered his expertise in setting up the training garage. Rosa organized a group of seamstresses to teach clothing repair and alterations. Even Mike, the former teacher, developed a basic business literacy program. But it was Thomas who surprised everyone, including himself, with his natural ability to mentor others. His years of homelessness, rather than being a liability, gave him unique insight into the challenges people faced. He could spot the difference between someone needing a handout and someone needing a hand up. You've got to understand, he told. A young man who reminded him of himself years ago. Losing everything doesn't mean you've lost your value. Sometimes it just means you need to rebuild from a different foundation. Sarah watched him work with growing admiration. In board meetings, she now found herself quoting his practical wisdom, cutting through corporate jargon with lessons learned. From the streets, the board members who had initially dismissed him as her homeless phase began to recognize the depth of knowledge they'd been missing. One evening, as they left the construction site of the future center, Thomas stopped to help a stranded motorist, an old habit he couldn't break. As he walked the driver through a simple repair, Sarah noticed a small group of shelter residents watching intently, absorbing the impromptu lesson. You know what the real difference is between then and now? Thomas asked later, cleaning his hands after the repair. Before I could help one person at a time, fix one car, solve one problem. But this, he gestured at the blueprint, which had become worn and marked with use, like a well-loved book. This is about teaching people to help themselves and then help others. Sarah squeezed his hand, leaving a smudge of grease neither of them bothered to wipe away. That's what real wealth is, isn't it? Not just having resources, but knowing how to share them in ways that multiply their value. The blueprint had evolved far beyond its original design, much like their relationship. Each revision, each handwritten note represented a lesson learned, a life touched, a small victory in their larger battle to prove that community value and corporate success didn't have to be opposing forces. Spring came to Cedar Grove, melting away the last traces of the winter that had brought them together. The Miller barn stood transformed, its weathered exterior now restored, but deliberately kept rustic. A new sign hung above its doors: Cedar Grove Emergency Shelter and Training Center. Each letter carefully hand-painted by community members who'd helped with the renovation. "Hard to believe this is the same place," Sarah said, standing in what had once been the dark corner where Thomas had found her. The space now held comfortable cots, clean blankets, and storage lockers for those who needed a safe place for their belongings. Thomas ran his hand along one of the original beams they'd preserved. "Some things haven't changed," he said softly. "Still a place for people who need to find their way." The barn's renovation had become a symbol of their larger mission. They'd kept the original structure, but reinforced it, added modern amenities while preserving its character, just as they'd done with their relationship, building something new without erasing where they'd come from. "Remember that first night?" Sarah asked, touching the spot where she'd once huddled, terrified and trying to hide her watch. "I thought I had lost everything. Didn't realize I was about to find what I'd been looking for all along." The transformation wasn't just physical. Where hay bales had once been stacked, there now stood training stations for basic car maintenance. The loft had become a classroom space where Mike taught business skills. One corner housed a small kitchen, where Maria from the diner taught cooking classes, helping people learn to manage on tight budgets. But perhaps the most significant change was in the people themselves. Jake, once so isolated in his post-military struggles, now ran the night shift, his protective instincts finding healthy expression in keeping others safe. Rosa had set up a sewing station where she taught both practical skills and creative expression through craft work. As they walked through the space, checking final preparations for the next day's commitment ceremony, Thomas paused by the newly installed heater, a far cry from the bitter cold of that first night. "You know what's funny? All those years I was homeless, I kept thinking about getting back what I'd lost. The shop, the status, the respect." He turned to Sarah, his eyes soft with understanding. "Never occurred to me that losing everything would lead to building something better." Sarah slipped her hand into his, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Better because it's not just about us. Every person who comes through that door," she nodded toward the entrance where their story had begun, "gets a chance to write their own ending," Thomas finished, "or their own beginning, depending on how you look at it." The sign caught the late afternoon light, its fresh paint gleaming. They'd insisted on using local craftsmen for all the renovations, providing work and training opportunities throughout the construction. Even Richard Maxwell had eventually come around, especially after seeing the positive press and community goodwill the project generated. "The boards officially approved the expansion program," Sarah said, watching shadows lengthen across the barn's new floor. 5 more communities by year's end, each one adapted to local needs, but following the Cedar Grove model. "Our model," Thomas corrected gently. "Corporate resources meeting street-level wisdom." They stood together in the growing dusk, just as they had that first night, but now surrounded by the physical manifestation of their shared vision. The barn had become more than a shelter. It was a testament to the possibility of change, both personal and systemic. Through the window, they could see Mr. Chen arriving with his radio, now permanently repaired and providing background music for their community gatherings. Rosa's granddaughter skipped alongside him, carrying decorations for tomorrow's ceremony. The sight of them, these people who had become family, made Sarah's heart swell. "You know," she said, "I never thanked you properly for that first night, for offering your blanket to a stranger who looked like trouble." Thomas smiled, remembering. "Always figured trouble was just another word for change waiting to happen." He squeezed her hand. "Besides, turned out to be the best investment I ever made." 1 year later, a framed photograph hung in the entrance of the Cedar Grove Emergency Shelter and Training Center. It showed Thomas and Sarah on the day of their commitment ceremony, standing in front of the barn where they'd first met. Neither was dressed formally. Sarah in a simple blue dress, Thomas in clean work clothes, but their faces shone with a joy that no camera could fully capture. The photo had become something of a talking point for newcomers to the shelter. Those who recognized Sarah as the Blackwood heiress often did double takes, especially when they found her in the garage area, teaching alongside Thomas in grease-stained clothes. But the story behind the picture had become Cedar Grove's favorite tale of redemption and possibility. "You should have seen this place a year ago," Jake would tell newcomers during his night shift rounds. "Just an old barn and a lot of broken dreams. Now look at it." He'd gesture to the bustling activity, the training classes, the support groups, the small business mentoring sessions. "Turns out hope's a lot like engine repair. Sometimes you just need the right tools and someone to show you how to use them." The Cedar Grove model, as it came to be known in corporate circles, had indeed expanded to 5 other communities as planned. But more significantly, it had sparked a national conversation about responsible corporate investment in small towns. Sarah's board presentations now included not just profit margins, but community impact metrics, measuring success in jobs created, businesses preserved, and lives transformed. Thomas's father's old shop had reopened under new management, a cooperative of local mechanics, including several graduates of the training center's programs. Thomas served as an advisor, but insisted on keeping his primary focus on the shelter and training programs. "Some things are worth more than ownership," he'd explain when asked why he didn't take charge of the shop himself, "like watching someone else discover their own potential." On this particular morning, Thomas and Sarah stood in their favorite spot, the quiet corner of the barn where 2 lost souls had once found each other. The space now housed a small library of business and technical manuals, along with comfortable reading chairs. Sarah held a letter that had arrived earlier that day. "The governor wants to use our program as a model for statewide community development," she said, still sounding somewhat amazed. "They're talking about legislation to incentivize corporate community partnerships." Thomas smiled, remembering their early conversations about what real value meant. "Think they'll understand that the secret isn't in the program itself? You mean that it's about seeing people as people, not problems to solve or assets to acquire?" Sarah leaned against him, comfortable in a way she'd never been in her old life. "Maybe not at first, but they'll learn." We did. Through the window, they could see Rosa teaching a young woman to repair a torn jacket, her granddaughter playing nearby with a toy car she'd helped Thomas fix. Mr. Chen's radio played softly in the background as he supervised a group of trainees, working on an engine. The scene was ordinary in its details, but extraordinary in its implications. "Sometimes I wonder," Sarah mused, "what would have happened if I hadn't run away that night? If I hadn't found this barn, hadn't met you?" "I don't," Thomas replied simply. "Some things are meant to find their way to each other, like people and purpose." He touched the frame of their photograph, this tangible proof of how far they'd come. "Besides, you didn't run away. You ran toward something. We both did." Sarah smiled, hearing the echo of words spoken long ago in the same space. "Toward something real," she agreed, though I don't think either of us knew exactly what that meant at the time. Outside, a new face appeared at the shelter's door. Someone else, looking for a chance, a change, a beginning. Jake moved to welcome them with the same care he'd once been shown. The cycle of help and hope continued, as natural as the seasons that had brought them all together. The photograph caught the morning light, highlighting the simple truth captured in that moment, that sometimes the richest lives are built not on what you have, but on what you're willing to share. And that real love, like real change, begins when you see past circumstances to the heart of what matters.